The morning sky over Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, was a deceptive canvas of tropical blues and cotton-white clouds, a serene backdrop for a desperate struggle for survival. High above the jungle canopy, United States Navy pilot James "Pug" Sutherland was locked in a spiraling dance of death that would become legendary in the annals of naval aviation. He was strapped into the cockpit of his F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, rugged machine that was outclassed in every kinematic metric by the predators swarming around him. Behind him, a flight of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the feared Imperial fighters of Japan, were diving to kill. Sutherland hauled back on his stick, forcing the Wildcat into a gut-wrenching turn, trying to bring his sights to bear on a Japanese bomber that had crossed his path. The geometry was fleeting. For a split second, the enemy silhouette filled his reflector sight. Sutherland clamped down on the trigger. The wings of his Wildcat erupted in flame and smoke as the .50 caliber Browning machine guns hammered away. Tracers streaked through the air like angry hornets, drawing lines of fire across the sky. But then, the nightmare scenario unfolded. Sutherland watched, helpless, as his bullets bracketed the enemy fuselage. Some rounds whizzed high, missing the canopy by inches. Others dipped low, tearing through empty air beneath the bomber's belly. A few stray rounds clipped the wings, but the concentrated, lethal blow he needed simply did not happen. It looked, in the frustration of the moment, as if he were trying to water a distant flower bed with a garden hose while running at full sprint. He wasn't missing because his aim was poor. Sutherland was a marksman. He was missing because of a fundamental flaw in fighter plane design that was getting American boys killed across the Pacific. He was fighting the laws of convergence. To truly understand the terror of that moment and why the Allies were struggling to knock the fragile Japanese planes out of the sky in the early days of the war, one must look away from the cockpit and out toward the wings. In 1942, the standard design philosophy for fighter aircraft, from the British Spitfire to the American Mustang and the Navy's Wildcat, dictated that the weaponry be mounted in the wings. This wasn't a tactical choice born of superior lethality. It was an engineering compromise born of necessity. The fuselage of a single-engine fighter was already crowded real estate, packed tight with a massive piston engine, fuel tanks, radio gear, and the pilot himself. There was simply no room on the center line for a battery of heavy machine guns, especially with a spinning propeller blocking the path. So the guns were pushed out to the only place they would fit, the heavy metal spars of the wings. This decision created a massive ballistic headache. Because the guns were mounted 5, 8, or even 10 feet away from the center of the aircraft, they were not pointing at what the pilot was looking at. If the mechanics mounted the guns perfectly parallel to the fuselage, the bullets would travel in two straight, non-intersecting lines, forever parallel, flanking the target on either side like lane markers on a highway. To hit a target that was usually skinny and sitting directly in the center of the pilot's vision, the guns had to be angled inward. This process, known as harmonization, created a convergence point. Ground crews would painstakingly adjust the mounts so that the streams of lead would cross paths at a specific distance, typically 300 yards ahead of the nose. Imagine the complexity of this. It was akin to trying to stab an opponent in the chest with two long pool cues while standing 10 feet apart. You have to angle the sticks inward perfectly to touch in the middle. In a static environment, this works. If the enemy plane was exactly 300 yards away and flying straight and level, he flew into a buzzsaw. The bullets converged, the kinetic energy multiplied, and the target disintegrated. But in the chaotic, tumbling, three-dimensional scream of a dogfight, nobody stood still. The convergence zone was a trap. If the Japanese pilot was 200 yards away, inside the convergence point, the American bullets would pass harmlessly on either side of his cockpit, a phenomenon pilots called boxing the target. The American would see his tracers surrounding the enemy, terrifying but ineffective. If the target was 400 yards away, beyond the cross, the bullets would cross and then spread out again, creating a widening shotgun pattern that lacked the density to do critical damage. This forced American pilots to perform complex trigonometry in their heads while pulling 5Gs, with sweat stinging their eyes and adrenaline flooding their veins. They had to estimate the range to the target with godlike precision. If they guessed wrong, they were just converting ammunition into noise. To compound the misery, airplane wings are not rigid slabs of concrete. They are flexible structures designed to bend under load. When a pilot yanked the stick back to pull out of a high-speed dive, the G-forces warped the wings, bending the tips upward. This physical distortion twisted the gun mounts. A pilot could have his sights lined up perfectly, but under the stress of the maneuver, his guns might be pointing 3 feet higher than they were on the ground. Thousands of rounds were burned, and hundreds of opportunities were lost, simply because the bullets refused to go where the pilot was looking. While Navy pilots cursed their wing-mounted guns in the humid skies of the Pacific, a team of iconoclastic engineers at the Lockheed Corporation in Burbank, California, was busy rewriting the rulebook of aviation. They were working on a machine that looked less like a fighter plane and more like a fever dream from a science fiction pulp magazine. It was designated the P-38, later to be known simply as the Lightning. It defied every convention of the era. It did not have a single fuselage, it had 3. 2 long, slender booms housed the massive Allison V-12 engines and the turbo superchargers, while a central pod housed the pilot. It was huge, heavy, and eerily silent in its approach, the exhaust muffled by the complex plumbing of the turbos. When it first appeared on the tarmac, the aviation world didn't know how to categorize it. The pilots, suspicious of anything that deviated from the norm, called it the flying ladder or the funny-looking bird. The British Royal Air Force, initially interested, took one look at the complex systems and the unorthodox layout and canceled their order, declaring it too complicated for combat. They argued that a fighter needed to be simple, nimble, and easily repairable. The P-38 was none of these things. It was a hot rod, a heavy interceptor built for blinding speed and stratospheric altitude, not for turning and burning in a phone booth. But the most radical innovation of the P-38 wasn't its twin tails or its counter-rotating propellers. It was the nose. The lead designer, a man whose name would become synonymous with aviation genius, Clarence Kelly Johnson, had looked at the convergence problem and decided it was an unacceptable variable. Johnson was a pragmatist. He didn't want his pilots guessing ranges. He didn't want his weapon system flexing with the wings. He wanted a rifle, not a shotgun. He realized that the P-38's unique twin-boom architecture offered a solution that no single-engine fighter could match. Because the vibrating, heavy engines were moved out to the wings, the central nacelle, the pod where the pilot sat, was free of obstruction. There was no propeller spinning in front of the windscreen. There was no engine block taking up the nose. Johnson decided to pack that empty space with the most concentrated arsenal ever fitted to a fighter plane. He didn't just install a pair of guns. He clustered 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns and a massive 20mm Hispano cannon directly in front of the pilot's feet. He packed them so tightly that the barrels were practically touching, protruding from the nose cone like the bristles of a deadly brush. It was a mechanic's nightmare. The internal volume was so cramped that the ammunition belts had to be fed through a labyrinth of chutes, and the heavy cannon sat right between the pilot's legs. The 20mm cannon was a beast, firing high explosive shells nearly an inch in diameter, capable of tearing a man in half or blowing a hole in an engine block the size of a watermelon. To the traditionalists in the Army Air Corps, putting that much firepower into a space the size of a bathtub seemed like overkill. The experts in Washington hated the design. They launched a campaign of criticism that nearly killed the project before it began. Their arguments were rooted in the doctrine of the era. They claimed that the average wartime pilot was not a marksman and needed the spread of wing-mounted guns to compensate for poor aim. They likened the wing-mounted array to a shotgun used for duck hunting. A wide pattern increased the probability of a hit, even if it was a grazing one. If you fired a tight stream, they argued, you had to be perfect. If you missed by an inch, you missed completely. They derided the P-38's nose cluster as a specialist's weapon, implying that only aces would ever be able to hit anything with it. There were also mechanical concerns. The vibration of firing 4 machine guns and a cannon simultaneously, all anchored to the same small structural frame, threatened to shake the rivets out of the nose skin. The Hispano cannon itself was notoriously temperamental, a heavy, jam-prone piece of machinery that required constant maintenance. In early tests, it would fire a few rounds and then seize up, leaving the pilot with only the machine guns. Critics seized on this reliability issue as proof that the design was too ambitious, too fragile for the rigors of war. They wanted simple, reliable, wing-mounted systems. They wanted what they understood. They looked at the P-38 and saw a gadget, a toy for engineers that would fail when dragged through the mud and blood of a real conflict. But the war was not waiting for the debate to settle in the conference rooms of the Pentagon. In the Pacific Theater, the situation was dire. The Japanese Zero was running wild, carving a path of destruction from the Philippines to the Coral Sea. It was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering, unarmored, devoid of self-sealing fuel tanks, but incredibly fast and agile. It could turn on a dime and give you change. American pilots in their heavy P-40 Warhawks and Wildcats were finding themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. They would dive on a Zero, get one brief, fleeting second to fire, and watch their bullets splash harmlessly around the target because of the convergence gap. Then, the Zero would flip over, defying gravity, and latch onto their tail. The Americans were desperate. They needed a plane that didn't need to turn. They needed a plane that could hit hard, hit fast, and dictate the terms of the engagement. They needed an executioner. The first P-38 squadrons arrived in the Pacific Theater with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. The pilots climbed into the cockpit and found themselves in a strange new world. The P-38 felt more like a luxury sedan than a weapon of war. It had a control yoke, a wheel instead of a stick. It had side windows that rolled down with a crank. It was smooth, stable, and tricycle-geared, sitting level on the runway rather than nose-high like the tail-draggers they were used to. But the most imposing feature was right in front of them. Just under the canvas shroud on the nose sat the cluster. 4 heavy barrels and 1 cannon muzzle pointed straight forward, unblinking, like the finger of doom. The pilots were skeptical. Their entire training had been built around the concept of the spread pattern. They had been taught to lead the target, to fill the sky with lead, to create a zone of danger. Now, they were being told to forget all of that. They were being told that their bullets would travel in a solid tube of lead, straight out to infinity. There was no convergence point to calculate. Whether the target was 50 yards away or 800 yards away, the bullets would hit exactly where the illuminated sight was pointed. It sounded good in the briefing room, just as the convergence theory had sounded good in the classroom. But paper doesn't shoot back, and theories don't stop zeros. As the first patrols roared off the dusty, coral-packed airstrips of New Guinea, the pilots felt the weight of the moment. They were flying a heavy, complex, twin-engine beast against the most agile fighters in the world. They knew the flying ladder was fast. They knew it could climb like a rocket. But they didn't know if that cramped, vibrating nose could actually kill. They were about to find out that the experts in Washington were wrong. They were about to discover that when you take away the spread, when you stop trying to box the target and instead focus the hate into a single point, you don't just poke holes in airplanes, you tear them apart. While the critics argued about probabilities, the engineers at Lockheed knew they had built something that ignored the laws of chance. The nose of the P-38 wasn't just a gun mount, it was a philosophical rejection of standard military doctrine. In every other fighter, the pilot was playing a game of angles, a messy equation involving bullet drop, wing flex, and target speed. Inside the nose of the Lightning, the math was stripped away. By clustering the firepower into a space scarcely wider than a man's shoulders, Kelly Johnson had created a point-and-shoot interface for death. The physics of this nose cluster were terrifyingly simple. In a Spitfire, the kill zone, The sweet spot where the bullets were concentrated enough to do fatal damage was perhaps 50 feet deep at the convergence point. Fire too early, you miss. Fire too late, you miss. But in the P-38, the bullets traveled parallel to each other. They didn't cross. They didn't spread. They flew in a tight, solid column, like the beams of a flashlight, straight out to the maximum effective range of the .50 caliber round. This changed everything. It meant that a P-38 pilot could open fire at 1,000 yards, a distance considered laughable for other fighters, and still land a concentrated burst. It meant that he didn't have to worry about the enemy being at the convergence point. Whether the Japanese Zero was filling his windscreen or was a speck half a mile away, the result was the same. If the sight was on the target, the bullets were on the target. The pilots began to call it the finger of God. You pointed it, and whatever you pointed it at simply ceased to exist. But the real game changer wasn't just the accuracy, it was the density. The .50 caliber machine gun was already a brutal weapon. A single round was the size of a marker pen, capable of punching through an engine block or severing a limb. Standard fighters carried 6 of them, but spread out across the wings, their impacts were scattered. A burst might put 2 rounds in the tail, 1 in the wing, and 1 in the cockpit. It was damaging, but it wasn't instantly fatal. A tough plane could absorb those scattered hits and limp home. The P-38 didn't scatter anything. It delivered all 4 streams of .50 caliber fire, plus the explosive shells from the cannon, into a circle the size of a dinner plate. This created a phenomenon known as the Buzzsaw Effect. When 5 heavy weapons hit the same square foot of aluminum at the same instant, the structure didn't just get a hole in it, it disintegrated. The metal couldn't handle the stress. The vibration and the kinetic energy shattered the spars. It was the difference between throwing a handful of gravel at a window pane and taking a sledgehammer to it. The gravel chips the glass. The sledgehammer removes it. And the centerpiece of this destruction was the 20mm Hispano cannon. This wasn't a machine gun. It was a piece of artillery. It fired a shell packed with high explosives. When it hit a Japanese bomber, it didn't pass through. It detonated inside the structure. The experts had hated the cannon because it was prone to jamming. But the mechanics in the Pacific, ingenious and desperate, found ways to make it sing. They greased it with unauthorized lubricants. They tweaked the feed mechanisms. They taught the pilots to fire in short, controlled bursts to prevent overheating. When it worked, it was devastating. One hit from the cannon was often enough to blow a wing off a fighter. Combined with the 4 machine guns, it created a 1-second kill capability. The pilots quickly realized that they didn't need to dogfight. In fact, turning with a Zero was still a death sentence. The Zero was a kite. The P-38 was a muscle car. If you slowed down to turn, the Zero would eat you alive. So the Americans developed a new tactic, the boom and zoom. They would use the Lightning's superior climbing speed to get high above the Japanese formation, lurking in the sun. Then they would tip the nose over and dive. The P-38 was heavy, over 15,000 pounds fully loaded, and it fell like a safe dropped from a skyscraper. It would scream down from the clouds, clocking over 400 miles per hour, the controls stiffening with the speed. The pilot would line up a Japanese plane in his sights. He wouldn't worry about leading the target excessively or calculating the convergence. He would just put the dot on the enemy fuselage and squeeze the trigger for 1 second. In that 1 second, the nose cluster would spit out roughly 60 rounds of .50 caliber ammo and 3 or 4 explosive cannon shells. Because of the parallel trajectory, all 64 projectiles would slam into the enemy plane at the exact same spot. The effect was gruesome. Wings would simply detach. Tails would fly off. Fuel tanks would vaporize into expanding fireballs. The Japanese pilots, who were used to seeing American tracers spraying wildly around them, were suddenly exploding before they even knew they were under attack. Then, before the surviving Zeros could turn to fight, the P-38 would use its immense momentum to zoom back up into the sky, untouchable, ready to repeat the process. The Japanese reaction was a mixture of confusion and fear. They couldn't understand how the Americans were hitting them from such long ranges. They were used to the knife fight ranges of the Wildcat battles, where you had to be close enough to see the enemy pilot's scarf. Now, planes were disintegrating from shots taken half a mile away. They started calling the P-38 the fork-tailed devil. It wasn't just the twin-boom shape of the plane that earned the name. It was the unnatural, unfair way it killed. It didn't fight fair. It didn't dance. It just executed. The learning curve for the P-38 pilots in the South Pacific was steep, brutal, and unforgiving. The buzzsaw in the nose was a weapon of immense power, but it demanded a level of discipline that American aviators were not used to. They had to unlearn the habits ingrained in them during flight training. They had to stop spraying and praying. With the nose guns, you couldn't sweep the sky like a garden hose to catch a target. You had to be precise. If your aim was off by 2 feet, you missed completely. The bullets traveled in such a tight tube that they would pass right under the enemy's wing without scratching the paint. It was an all-or-nothing weapon. You either destroyed the target instantly, or you hit nothing but air. This reality led to a new kind of training regimen. The instructors, veterans of the early skirmishes, told the new pilots to treat the nose of the plane like a sniper rifle. "Don't fire until you see the rivets," they said. But the smart pilots realized they could fire much sooner. They realized that the finger of God allowed them to snipe bombers from well outside the effective range of the bomber's defensive gunners. A Japanese G-4M Betty bomber had a tail cannon, but it was inaccurate at long range. A P-38 pilot could park himself 800 yards behind the bomber, sit comfortably out of reach of the return fire, and surgically remove the bomber's engines one by one. The psychological impact on the Japanese bomber crews was immense. In the early days of the war, the Betty bombers had roamed the Pacific with impunity. They were fast, had incredible range, and destroyed Allied shipping at will. Now, they were falling out of the sky in pieces. The crews began to dread the sight of the twin-tailed silhouettes. They knew that the flying ladder didn't just poke holes in their fuel tanks to start slow leaks. It sawed their planes in half. As 1942 turned into 1943, the P-38 squadrons began to rack up scores that embarrassed the experts back home. The pilots who had been told that the nose guns were cramped and unnecessary were now coming back with gun camera footage that looked like horror movies. The film didn't show the usual smoke and sparks. It showed structural annihilation. A bomber would be flying along, and then, in a single frame, the entire right wing would separate from the fuselage. It was violent, efficient, and horrifyingly effective. One particular engagement over New Guinea cemented the reputation of the nose cluster. A patrol of P-38s intercepted a convoy of Japanese troop transports escorted by Zeros. The Zeros tried to lure the Americans into a turning fight, the classic trap, but the Lightning pilots ignored them. They dove straight through the fighter screen and went for the transports. A pilot named Lieutenant Sparks lined up on a transport plane. It was a big, slow target. In a Wildcat, he would have had to make multiple passes, strafing the fuselage, hoping to hit something vital while the gunners shot back. In the P-38, Sparks just held the trigger down. The nose guns roared. A solid stream of tracers connected the nose of his Lightning to the wing root of the transport. It looked like a laser beam made of fire. The wing of the transport didn't just catch fire, it sheared off. The heavy spars, the fuel lines, the metal skin, all of it was severed by the concentrated impact of hundreds of rounds hitting the same 12-inch circle. The transport flipped over and crashed into the sea. Sparks pulled up, looking for another target. He hadn't even used a quarter of his ammunition. He realized then that the experts had been wrong about everything. The density of fire wasn't overkill. In a war where the enemy was trying to kill you, there was no such thing as overkill. There was only open fire and reloading. The escalation had begun. The Japanese responded by adding more armor to their bombers and trying to develop faster fighters, but they couldn't fix the fundamental flaw in their design philosophy. They were still building light, agile planes meant for a duel. The Americans were building flying gun platforms meant for slaughter. The P-38 was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was a machine built around a gun, designed to deliver the maximum amount of kinetic energy in the minimum amount of time. Back at the air bases, the mechanics were still cursing the cramped nose. Changing the ammunition belts was a pain. Cleaning the cannon was a dirty, knuckle-busting job. But they stopped complaining about the concept. They saw the planes coming back. They saw the pilots walking away from missions that would have killed them in any other aircraft. And they saw the tally marks painted on the nose pods growing longer every week. The Buzzsaw was hungry, and the Pacific was full of targets. But the true test was yet to come. The P-38 had proven it could kill bombers. It had proven it could slash through Zeros. But the Japanese Empire wasn't going to give up the sky without a fight. They were sending their best pilots, their aces, to the front lines to stop the American advance. And among the American ranks, a new breed of pilot was emerging. These weren't just men who flew the plane. They were men who understood the geometry of the nose guns instinctively. Men like Richard Bong and Tommy Maguire were about to take the flying ladder and turn it into the deadliest weapon in the history of aerial warfare. They were about to show the world what happens when you put a sniper rifle in a cockpit. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the theory of the nose cluster collided with the reality of the Japanese Navy in a stretch of water known as the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese High Command had gambled everything on a massive convoy. 8 troop transport ships, escorted by 8 destroyers and nearly 100 fighter planes, were steaming toward New Guinea to reinforce their crumbling positions. It was a floating army. Against them, the Americans launched everything they had. But the tip of the spear was the 39th Fighter Squadron flying the P-38 Lightning. Major George "Pappy" Gunn and the other flight leaders had drilled the tactics into their men until they could do it in their sleep. They knew the Japanese Zeros would be waiting high above the ships, flying top cover. In a standard plane like the Wildcat, the Americans would have to climb up to meet them, getting dragged into a swirling dogfight where the nimble Zeros held all the cards. But the P-38 pilots didn't climb. They stayed high, lurking in the sun, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash the physics of their nose-mounted arsenal. At 10 a.m., the clouds broke, revealing the Japanese convoy spread out across the dark blue water like toy boats in a bathtub. The Zeros were patrolling in lazy circles, confident that they could swarm any attacker who tried to get close to the precious transports. They didn't see the twin-tailed shapes diving from 20,000 feet. The P-38s were coming down at over 450 miles per hour, screaming toward the terminal velocity of the airframe. The pilots weren't looking to dance. They were looking to slash. The engagement began with a violence that shocked the Japanese pilots. A flight of Zeros turned to intercept the diving Americans, expecting the usual turning fight. But the P-38s didn't turn. They held their course, committing to a head-on pass. This is usually a game of chicken, a test of nerves where 2 planes fly straight at each other, firing until one pilot flinches and pulls away. In a head-on pass, the convergence trap of wing-mounted guns is a fatal flaw. You have to guess the range perfectly while closing at a combined speed of 800 miles per hour. If you fire too early, your bullets go wide. If you fire too late, you collide. But the Lightning pilots didn't have to guess. They had the finger of God. At 1,000 yards, over half a mile away, the American pilots opened fire. The 4 50-caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon erupted in unison. Because there was no convergence, the bullets traveled in a tight, parallel column. The Japanese pilots, who were used to seeing enemy fire spray harmlessly from that distance, suddenly found themselves flying into a solid wall of lead. The lead Zero didn't just catch fire, it evaporated. The high-explosive cannon shells smashed into the radial engine block, blowing the cylinders apart. The heavy machine gun rounds punched through the cockpit glass and the pilot before he could even touch his trigger. The plane disintegrated in mid-air, turning into a cloud of aluminum confetti and burning oil. The P-38 flew right through the debris cloud, the pilot never touching the control yoke, his thumb still resting on the cannon button. He had won the game of chicken before the other guy even knew the game had started. Having punched a hole through the fighter screen, the Lightnings continued their dive toward the real targets, the bombers and the transports. The Japanese were flying G-4M Betty bombers low over the water to protect the ships. The Betty was a fast, long-range aircraft, but it had a fatal weakness. Its fuel tanks were unarmored rubber bags located in the wings. American pilots called them flying Zippos or one-shot lighters because they burned so easily. But usually, you had to get close to light them up. Lieutenant Richard Bong, a young pilot who was quickly making a name for himself, lined up on a Betty bomber. He was coming in fast, slashing down from the rear. In any other plane, he would have had to worry about the Japanese tail gunner. A 20mm cannon in the tail of a bomber could ruin your day if you sat behind it for too long. But Bong didn't need to get close. He settled his sight on the right wing root of the bomber from 600 yards away, well outside the effective range of the Japanese gunner. He squeezed the trigger for exactly 1 second. The nose of his P-38 vibrated as the buzzsaw went to work. The stream of fire connected the two planes like a rigid steel bar. All 4 machine guns and the cannon hit the exact same square foot of the bomber's wing. The structural failure was immediate and catastrophic. The main spar, the metal beam that holds the wing to the fuselage, was sawed in half by the sheer density of the impact. The right wing of the bomber simply folded up over the fuselage. The plane snapped into a violent spin, vomiting fuel and fire. It hit the water a second later, cartwheeling into a massive explosion. Bong pulled up, using the immense momentum of his heavy fighter to rocket back up into the sky. He hadn't just damaged the enemy, he had surgically removed him from the battle. He looked for his next target. He had plenty of ammo left. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Japanese convoy was trapped. The P-38s were operating with total impunity. They would dive, destroy a target with a precision burst, and zoom back to altitude. They were dismantling the Japanese air cover piece by piece. The Japanese pilots were fighting bravely, twisting and turning, trying to lure the Americans into the mud. But the Americans refused to play by the old rules. They used the vertical space, they used their speed, and most of all, they used that terrifying nose cluster. One P-38 pilot found himself behind a frantic Zero that was braking hard to the left. In a P-40 or a Wildcat, the pilot would have had to pull lead, aiming way ahead of the target, hoping his wing guns would create a shotgun pattern that the Zero would fly into. But with the nose guns, the pilot just tracked the enemy. He waited until the Zero's profile flattened out for a split second as it reversed its turn. He fired a short burst. The rounds hit the Zero's fuselage like a jackhammer. The tail section was severed from the rest of the plane. The Japanese fighter tumbled out of control, leaving the pilot spinning in a cockpit that was no longer attached to a rudder. It was a brutal demonstration of kinetic energy. The P-38 wasn't poking holes, it was chopping wood. By noon, the sky over the Bismarck Sea was clear of Japanese fighters. They were either in the water or running for home. Now the P-38s turned their attention to the ships. The troop transports were sitting ducks, wallowing in the water, their decks crowded with thousands of soldiers. The P-38 wasn't designed as a dive bomber, but with the nose cluster, it didn't need bombs. It became the world's most efficient strafing machine. The pilots lined up on the ships. They dove at a shallow angle, skimming the waves. They opened fire at long range. The 20mm cannon shells smashed through the thin steel hulls of the transports. The 50-caliber rounds walked across the decks, tearing through the wooden planking and the men standing on it. The water around the ships began to boil with the impacts. Standard wing-mounted guns were terrible for strafing ships. Because the guns were set wide apart, you had to fly directly at the ship to hit it. If you tried to shoot a small target, like a lifeboat or a bridge, Half your bullets would hit the water on either side. But the P-38 directed everything into a single point. The pilots could rake the ship from bow to stern, walking the fire right down the center line. They targeted the bridges, killing the captains and the helmsmen. They targeted the engine rooms. They targeted the anti-aircraft gunners. It was a grim, mechanical process. The pilots would make a pass, pull up, circle around, and do it again. The nose guns never jammed. The feed chutes, which the critics had called complicated and prone to failure, worked perfectly in the cool air of the dive. The cannon, often maligned as unreliable, thumped away with a steady, rhythmic cadence. The experts who had said the vibration would shake the plane apart were proven wrong by every smoking wreck in the water. The nose was solid as a rock. One pilot reported cutting a Japanese landing barge in half. The barge was made of wood, carrying 50 soldiers. The pilot fired a 2-second burst. The combined weight of the heavy cannon shells and the machine gun rounds acted like a chainsaw. The barge literally split down the middle, spilling its cargo into the shark-infested water. It wasn't war anymore. It was extermination. As the P-38s turned for home, their ammunition counters reading empty, the scene below them was apocalyptic. The Bismarck Sea was covered in oil slicks, burning ships and debris. The Japanese convoy had been annihilated. They had lost all 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Over 3,000 Japanese troops were dead. The Americans had lost only a handful of planes. The pilots flew back to their bases in New Guinea, their arms tired from wrestling the heavy yokes, their ears ringing from the roar of the engines. But their spirits were soaring. They had faced the best the Japanese Empire had to offer, and they had crushed them. They had proven that the P-38 wasn't a clumsy ladder or a failed experiment. It was a predator. When they landed, the ground crews ran out to meet them. They looked at the nose caps of the planes. The paint was blistered from the heat of the gun barrels. The canvas covers were shredded. The soot from the cannon muzzle coated the front of the pod. But the planes were intact. They hadn't fallen apart. They hadn't malfunctioned. The pilots climbed out, sweaty and exhausted, and told the stories that would become legends. They talked about sawing wings off bombers. They talked about blowing Zeros out of the sky from half a mile away. They talked about the Buzzsaw Effect. The skepticism was gone. In its place was a cold, hard respect for the machine. The critics in Washington could argue about convergence and spread patterns all they wanted. The men in the Pacific knew the truth. When you want to kill something dead, right now, you use a P-38. When the engines finally shut down on the airstrips of New Guinea, the silence that followed was heavy. The pilots of the P-38 squadrons climbed out of their cockpits, their flight suits soaked with sweat, their legs shaky from hours of wrestling a 15,000-pound machine through the sky. They walked around to the front of their planes to inspect the damage. The noses of the Lightnings were blackened with soot, stained by the exhaust of thousands of rounds of ammunition. The paint on the gun barrels was blistered and peeling from the heat. But the mechanics didn't look at the cosmetic damage with worry. They looked at it with pride. They ran their hands over the cramped gun ports that the experts in Washington had hated so much. They knew that every smudge of gunpowder represented a Japanese plane that wasn't coming home. The vindication of the P-38 didn't just come from the battle reports. It came from the scoreboards. As the war in the Pacific dragged on, a new kind of ace began to emerge. These weren't the wild, stick-and-rudder dogfighters of the First World War who relied on instinct and lucky shots. These were technicians. They were men who understood that the P-38 wasn't a toy. It was a high-speed gun platform. They learned to fly it like a calculator, using its speed to dictate the engagement and its nose-mounted buzzsaw to end it. The greatest proof of the design came in the form of 2 men, Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. They were the top 2 American aces of the entire war, and both of them flew the P-38. Richard Bong was a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin who looked like he should be delivering newspapers, not killing people. He racked up 40 confirmed kills. He didn't get them by getting into swirling knife fights with Zeros. He got them by using the lightning speed to ambush the enemy and the nose cluster to destroy them before they could react. He was known for getting in close, sometimes so close that he flew through the debris of his victims, because he knew that with the nose guns he couldn't miss. Tommy Maguire was the opposite. He was abrasive, technical, and obsessed with the rules of combat. He wrote a literal book on how to fly the P-38 in combat. He preached the gospel of the nose cluster. He told his new pilots to forget everything they had learned about deflection shooting and spray patterns. He taught them that the P-38 was a sniper rifle. He scored 38 kills, just 2 behind Bong. Together, these two men proved that the experts who called the nose guns unnecessary were completely wrong. They showed that in the unforgiving math of aerial warfare, the only thing that mattered was putting the maximum amount of lead into the smallest possible space. By 1944, the P-38 was no longer the funny-looking bird or the flying ladder. It was the fork-tailed devil, a machine that struck fear into the heart of the Japanese Empire. It was doing everything. It was shooting down bombers. It was strafing ships. It was carrying bombs to destroy bridges. It was even being used as a night fighter, hunting in the dark with radar pods attached to the nose. The design that had been rejected by the British and mocked by the Army brass had become the versatile workhorse of the Pacific. But the end of the war brought a cruel twist for the Lightning. The technology of aviation was moving at breakneck speed. Even as the P-38s were clearing the skies over the Philippines, the first jet fighters were appearing in the skies over Germany. The jet engine changed everything. It made the propeller-driven fighters obsolete overnight. The P-38, with its complex twin engines and its big, heavy airframe, was suddenly a dinosaur. It was a masterpiece of the piston engine era, but that era was ending. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the United States found itself with thousands of surplus warplanes scattered across the islands of the Pacific. It was too expensive to ship them all back home, so the military made a cold, calculated decision. They stripped the radios and the guns out of the P-38s. They drained the fuel and the oil, and then they brought in the bulldozers. It is one of the most heartbreaking images for any aviation lover to imagine. Massive bulldozers pushed pristine P-38s into giant piles. These were planes that had just won the war. Some of them had only a few hours of flight time on the clocks. They were pushed into pits and crushed. They were burned. They were shoved off the decks of aircraft carriers into the ocean. The fork-tailed devils that had terrorized the Japanese Navy were turned into scrap metal or artificial reefs. The pilots who had trusted these machines with their lives had to watch them being destroyed like garbage. Only a handful survived. Today, there are fewer than a dozen P-38s left in the world that can still fly. If you go to a museum and stand in front of one, you are struck by how big it is. It looms over you, a twin-boomed giant from a forgotten age. But if you walk around to the nose, you can still see the genius of Kelly Johnson. You can see the 4 holes for the 50 caliber machine guns and the center port for the 20mm cannon. You can see how tightly they are packed together. You can imagine the vibration, the noise, and the sheer violence that erupted from that small space when the pilot pressed the button. The legacy of the P-38 isn't just in the kill counts of Bong and Maguire. It is in the lesson it taught the military. The argument about convergence versus nose-mounted guns was settled once and for all. When the jet age arrived, the designers stopped putting guns in the wings. The F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, the F-15 Eagle, they all put their guns in the nose or the fuselage, right on the center line. They realized that Kelly Johnson was right. You don't want a shotgun in a dogfight. You want a laser. The P-38 proved that innovation, often looks like madness to the people who are used to the old ways. It proved that weird designs are often just solutions to problems that nobody else has figured out yet. The experts looked at the nose cluster and saw a cramped mechanic's nightmare. The pilots looked at it and saw a way to stay alive. They saw a weapon that didn't leave anything to chance. In a war where a split second meant the difference between going home and going down in flames, the P-38 gave them the edge they needed. We rescue these stories to ensure that the fork-tailed devil and the men who flew it don't disappear into silence. We tell them because we need to remember that the tools of victory were often forged in the face of doubt and mockery. We tell them because we need to honor the memory of men like Richard Bong, who survived 40 battles in the air, only to die testing a new jet fighter before the war even officially ended. They were the pioneers who pushed the envelope until it tore. If this story of the buzzsaw and the plane that sawed the Japanese Air Force in half moved you, share it. Every single view fights the algorithm and helps us keep these histories alive. We are digging through the archives every week to find the stories of the hardware and the heroes that changed the world. You are the keepers of this history just as much as we are. Thank you for reading, and thank you for making sure the fork-tailed devil is never forgotten.